If the history and reputation of the Western Conservative Summit is known for anything, it is known for bringing to Denver insightful, if not sometimes provocative, conservative thinkers. These purveyors of big ideas are here to impact the policies of nations as well as the thinking and actions of their citizens. Consistent with its mission to enhance the public's understanding of policies involving faith, family, and freedom, the summit has reached across the Atlantic to a man who is no stranger to espousing policies that will draw the ire of some of his European colleagues. Our next speaker, Member of European Parliament Daniel Hannan, is the author of 8 books and counting. As one reader wrote of his most recent book, published this past year, entitled Inventing Freedom: How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World, a must-read for people who value individual liberty, democracy, property rights, and the rule of law. Mr. Hannan is a writer and blogger and has been a member of the European Parliament representing Southeast England since 1999. He graduated with a double first in history from Oriel College, Oxford, and has worked as a speechwriter and journalist before standing for election to the European Parliament. In 2009, he was awarded the Bastiat Prize for Online Journalism for his regular blog on the Daily Telegraph. In 2014, he won the Political Books Award Polemic of the Year Award for his most recent book on freedom. His previous book, published in 2010, entitled New Road to Serfdom: A Letter of Warning to America, was a New York Times bestseller. A husband and father of 2, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Daniel Hannan.
Yeah, we gotta stop looking at the hands of the time we've been giving it. This is all we got, then we gotta stop thinking it. Every second counts on the clock that's ticking. Gotta live like we're dying.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. London in August 1647 was a tense and frightened city. The English Civil War had just come to an end. Believers in parliamentary supremacy had, thank God, triumphed over believers in royal absolutism. But it was already becoming clear that the true power in the land were the troopers, the Puritan troopers of the new model army, who were advancing, angry and unpaid, on the capital city. Parliament, in a conciliatory gesture to the soldiers, appointed their commander, Sir Thomas Fairfax, as Constable of the Tower of London. And the first act of that Roundhead general on taking up his office was an extremely encouraging one. He called for the greatest treasure in the Tower to be brought before him. Not a crown or a scepter or a casket full of gems, but an old, desiccated parchment covered with faded Latin script. Parchment sealed 800 years ago next June. And as he picked up the copy of Magna Carta, he breathed reverentially, "This is that we have fought for, and by God's help, we must maintain." Now, why am I coming here and talking to the Western Conservative Summit about this document sealed 8 centuries ago? America, after all, is a famously forward-looking country. Your remote ancestors came here at one time or another, keen to shake the dust of the old world from their shoes. And perhaps here in the West, you have the most forward-looking part. People came long distances to become Americans. They then traveled even further distances. The most independent, the most self-starting, the most self-reliant came here to these rectangular states. Anyway, I'm allowed to call them that. This one actually I think is rectangular, isn't it? And they replicated, purified, distilled the things that make the US political system so strong: the dispersal of power, the ballot initiatives, the referendums, the popular choice, and they've used them. As I understand it, you've used them in Colorado to have term limits, to have a charter for taxpayers and so on. The system has worked here, so why am I talking about this old document? Here, in The state, which, according to Ayn Rand, is going to be the last bastion of freedom. We all know that Galt's Gulch is situated somewhere in this rectangle. She doesn't specify where. I'm guessing it's not Boulder County or Pueblo. Hey, nothing against anyone from Pueblo here. I have a lovely cousin who grew up in Pueblo. There are wonderful people. Even the Pueblo Democrats are good, patriotic, and generous sorts. We should always remember that. But why am I talking about something so old in a place that is so proverbially forward-looking? Well, you know what, my friends? Magna Carta is the shared patrimony of all the people who speak the language in which you're listening to these words. John Wilkes, great champion of American rights in the 18th century, when he was locked up in the same tower that Thomas Fairfax had founded in, said it is the distinguishing characteristic of all Englishmen, by which, of course, he included, at that time, all Americans. Lord Denning, perhaps the most celebrated jurist in my country in the 20th century, said it is the greatest constitutional document of all time, the supreme defense of individual freedom against the arbitrary power of the despot. That old bit of paper is, to us who speak this language, if I may use a biblical analogy, it's our Torah. It's the text that sets us apart, and yet, paradoxically, at the same time, the text that speaks universal truths to mankind. And especially, we remember it here in this country. I think it's always meant a lot more on this side of the Atlantic than in the place where it was agreed. Hatton Sumner's, the great jurist in the 1930s, evolving his arguments against Roosevelt's New Deal, said, "A straight line runs from Runnymede to Philadelphia." And he was right. The founders were not revolutionaries in their own minds. They were conservatives. They were looking back to an ancient heritage of freedom that they traced back through the English Glorious Revolution, back through the Civil War, back to that magical moment by the river with the reeds at Runnymede, that moment of planetary significance, where for the first time ever, the idea that the law was above the government took written contractual form. Magna Carta was constantly in the minds of the delegates to the Continental Congresses. When Massachusetts as a state adopted its first seal, it was a patriot holding a sword in one hand and a copy of the Great Charter in the other. Your Supreme Court has cited Magna Carta more than 100 times. Believe me when I tell you, it means more here than in the place in my district where it was signed. David Cameron, our Prime Minister, was in New York a couple of years ago. He did a TV interview with David Letterman, and he was asked, what does Magna Carta mean? Literally, what do the words mean? And he didn't know the answer. Or at least he pretended not to know the answer. I suspect he knew, really. I mean, David Cameron was at the most famous and prestigious private school in England, Eton. He did compulsory Latin for most of his youth. The idea that he couldn't have translated Magna Carta. I mean, Magna is a first declension adjective. Carta, okay, you can infer that one from context, can't you? My theory about this is that he was hamming up the part of a kind of Hugh Grant English Prime Minister. We like to think that you like that. But the point is, his audience did know much more about it than he did, and they always have. You know, I mentioned that the site where it was sealed is in my constituency, in Runnymede. It went completely unmarked until the late 1950s, when a memorial stone was finally erected there by the American Bar Association. And to this day, that's the only monument. Now, if I can digress for one moment, I said the 800th anniversary is coming up in June of next year. I am very keen to have a worthier and larger memorial than that one erected at the site. And if anyone knows any philanthropists here who might be prepared to contribute and be involved with that, please come and see me. I'll be signing my book at 11:45 afterwards. But I mean it when I say this has always mattered more here than there. There are 4 original copies of Magna Carta, 4 that were contemporaneously signed at the field itself. One of them is in Salisbury Cathedral, one's in Lincoln Cathedral, 2 at the British Library. Lincoln's is generally held to be the best one. And it's just arrived actually for a tour. It's in Boston at the moment. I think it's going on to New York, and it's attracting large crowds. Believe me, when I tell you that when I visited it with my kids not long ago, there was no line, there was no fuss, it was all very low-key. But when that same document from Lincoln Cathedral was exhibited in New York in 1939, an almost incredible 14 million people crushed in to look at it. The Second World War broke out while it was still on display, and it remained in Fort Knox for safekeeping until the victory. The aptest possible symbol of what the English-speaking peoples were fighting for in that conflict, namely a system that elevates the individual above the collective, that reveres the law rather than raw power. Because that was the real miracle of Runnymede. That was the really providential thing. The idea that the power did not come from the king or from the biggest guy in the tribe, but that there was something above the king, something that you couldn't see or taste or touch or hear, but that bound the mightiest monarch as surely as it bound his meanest subject, and that something was the law of the land, a phrase that appears in the Charter itself, a law immanent in a people and in their territory. And if you grant that, my friends, almost everything else follows. You have property rights, you have personal liberty, you have constitutional freedom, you have the makings of the free market system that has elevated our species to a pinnacle of happiness that would recently have been unimaginable. And the things that we now take for granted, regular elections and jury trials and equality between men and women and uncensored newspapers and habeas corpus, those things are not the natural condition of mankind. It's so easy to become blasé about the things that are familiar to us, to take things for granted. But those wonderful precepts, they're not the natural condition of an advanced society. They're not something that every country gets to when it becomes wealthy enough and educated enough. They are precepts overwhelmingly developed in the language in which I am speaking these words. And if we now sometimes think of them as Western values or even universal values, you know what? We're being polite. They became Western values or even universal values, if we're honest, because of a series of military victories by the English-speaking peoples when your fathers and ours fought together for freedom. Let me take you back to another August 1940, the day that Franklin Roosevelt made the longest walk of his presidency. He'd been invited by Winston Churchill to join him on the decks of HMS Prince of Wales. Now, up until then, in a way that would be literally unimaginable today, the media had contrived to hide the fact of President Roosevelt's polio from the electorate. Photographs had always shown him standing unaided or seated. But on that occasion, he was determined literally to rise to the occasion. And supported on one side by his son, on the other by a naval officer leaning heavily on a cane, he made his slow way across the swaying decks of HMS Prince of Wales as the band struck up the Stars and Stripes Forever. And what followed was the most extraordinary, visible manifestation of the values that hold the peoples of the Anglosphere together. It happened to be a Sunday morning, and the crews of the two vessels were assembled for a joint religious service, the USS Augusta that had carried FDR and HMS Prince of Wales. Churchill had chosen every detail of that service personally and meticulously, down to the hymns that the two groups of sailors sang, one of which had been performed at the funeral of John Hampden, the great hero of the parliamentary cause in our Civil War, after whom one of the first US warships had been named. He'd chosen even the reading himself. Came from Joshua 1. As I was with Moses, so will I be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage. And afterwards, exultantly, Churchill burst out to enaid the same language, the same hymns, the same ideals. And when he said the same ideals, He wasn't making some bland generalization about being the good guys. Think of the world as it stood at the beginning of the 1940s. Constitutional freedom was confined to the Anglosphere, to the community of free English-speaking democracies. The whole of the Eurasian landmass, from Seoul and Vladivostok to Brest and Lisbon, was under one form or another of authoritarianism. Everybody thought that our system was finished. Listen to the language that the Nazis and the communists all used to describe what they always called decadent Anglo-Saxon capitalism or rotten Anglo-Saxon capitalism. It seemed obvious to them that their collective systems that emphasized sacrifice and virtue in numbers and collective government action that elevated the state above the citizen must triumph over the individualism of our system. But thank heaven they were wrong. And the victory of our values ushered in a period of prosperity and happiness that our species had never before encountered. Until very recently. Yeah, some of you have seen where I'm going to go with this, right? Here's a scary statistic. 100 years ago, your government spent 7.5% of the economy. 50 years ago, it was 27%. 10 years ago, it was 32%. Today, it's 42%. You can't carry on like this. More debt has been accumulated under this president than under his 43 predecessors. We've got to the point where the money has run out, where service providers have become pension providers, where the primary function of the government bureaucracy is the employment of its own employees, where the mayor of San Bernardino in California has to say, lock up your doors and buy guns because there are no police anymore. The money has run out. Things can't carry on, and it's not just your problem. If we look around the world, we see your country derided and traduced, from Ukraine to Syria, places where prestige is a hard and almost tangible commodity. Unpleasant regimes are making the calculation that they don't need to worry about the goodwill of the West anymore and are beginning to cozy up to altogether less pleasant systems of government. And why is that happening? Well, to make a very obvious point, when you have a $17 trillion national debt, you're not going to be in the same position to deploy force that you were in when you were in charge of your finances. We occasionally get these pro-EU US legislators coming over to Brussels and saying, is there anything we can do for you, is there anything we can do to... And I always say, yes, get on top of your debt crisis. If you do that, everything else will follow. There's something wrong, isn't there, with my having to come here to say that? This is the country that was founded on the ideal of the dispersal of power, the constraint of government, on the decentralization, the diffusion, the democratization of decision-making. And yet, it's turned its back on its own, or it's turning its back on its own foundation. This afternoon, I'm flying on to San Francisco. Last time I was there, being surrounded by all the vine-growing country, I was struck by an irresistible metaphor about wine growing. I spoke about how the first vineyards in California had been planted, of course, from ancestral stock from European vineyards, from France, from Spain, from Italy. And I spoke about how in the 19th century there'd been a terrible blight, a plague called phylloxera, that had almost completely wiped out European viticulture. I spoke about how the wine growers in the 19th century had to come to California to take clippings of the descendants and bring them back to the old vineyards and thus begin the process, the industry of wine growing again in the ancestral places. And I'd spoken about how my dream had always been to do something similar in politics. Coming from a country that has seen its government grow, seen its sovereignty given to the European Union, I dreamed of being able to re-import elements of the Anglosphere model. And I spoke about what it would have been like for those wine growers if they had arrived in California only to find that they were too late. that the aphids had got there before them, that the egg was already on the leaf. Well, do you know what? I was thinking about something last night. We don't even need wine as a metaphor. What about wine as a reality? It suddenly struck me. I was sitting upstairs in the, whatever it's called, the Peaks Bar, looking out over the Rockies, having a glass of Pinot Noir. And I was thinking, here is a wine which in quality and consistency is beyond anything that Louis XIV could have dreamed of. And it's what, $20 a bottle? That is the real miracle of our system. One that brings that kind of richness into the power of ordinary workers. The great economist Joseph Schumpeter said, "The achievement of capitalism is not to supply more silk stockings to princesses, but to bring them within the reach of factory girls." And that's what happens when you have the law above the government. That's all you need. Secure property, free contract, an independent magistracy, everything else follows. You can trust the rest to the enterprise, to the bold, quizzical, spirited restlessness of a free people. And that's what it is we stand to lose. That system that has done so much for the happiness of our species and that is now being choked by excessive government here. My friends, that's our collective achievement. That's our shared patrimony, we who speak this language. That's the road that runs from Runnymede to Philadelphia, and that now, becoming a little bit bendier, maybe a little bit more of a track in places, is still carrying on, taking us to our present. And we have to decide whether we're going to carry on down that road or whether we're going to give it up. Hatton Sumners went on in the same speech to say, "We have no king. We are our own masters. If we, the people, fail, constitutional government fails with us." Think about the responsibility that you have inherited. You are the heirs to the best, the noblest, the most sublime constitutional dispensation ever evolved by human intelligence. And that inheritance carries with it a duty to preserve intact the freedoms that you inherited from your parents and to pass them on securely to your children. My friends, never be afraid to speak to and for the soul of this nation, of which, by good fortune and God's grace, you are privileged to be part.